Hi there. Thank you for watching this video tutorial from RBA Supplies. In this video tutorial we're going to talk about coiling READYxWICK both as a pre-coil and as directly coiling on the wick itself. There are some disadvantages and advantages to doing either, and we're going to discuss some of those facts. First, we're going to cover pre-coiling the wick at certain diameters used by what typically people would use would be a drill bit. So here we have 1/16, 5/64, 3/32, 7/64, and 1/8. Let's go ahead and start with covering the 2mm READYxWICK Slim product. For that, we're going to use the 1/16 or the 5/64. We'll talk about some of the advantages to that here in just a minute. Alright, there. With our coil in focus, we can see on the right hand side the 1/16 size coil, and on the left hand side the 5/64 to give you a size comparison. Let's go ahead and start with the 5/64 and we'll talk about some advantages and some disadvantages to this size of pre-coil for READYxWICK Slim, which is the 2mm READYxWICK product. One of the advantages for the 5/64 size pre-coil for READYxWICK Slim, as you can see here, the coil quite easily goes in and out, or rather the wick quite easily goes in and out of that coil. It really isn't too difficult to get the wick into the coil whatsoever. To give you a comparison showing you from the bottom up, as you can see, when we put the wick into the coil, it's just about the same size as the coil, but the coil is a little bit larger than the wick itself. So what are the advantages and what are the disadvantages to this 5/64 inch pre-coil size? Well, one of the obvious advantages is it's very easy to get the wick in and out of the coil. The other advantage would be for high VG users that have a little bit of a thicker oil base. That VG concentrate might be able to find its way to the coils a little easier in this 5/64 inch size as opposed to the smaller size coil, which is the 1/16. So if you're a high VG user, or if you have difficulty threading your wick into your coil, you might find that this 5/64 inch size works a little better for you. However, in most cases, the 5/64 size is going to be a little bit too big for the READYxWICK Slim or 2mm size product. For that, typically we would want to use the smaller size coil, which is the 1/16. One of the difficulties with this size coil and this size wick, though, is that it's so perfectly matched. Let me go ahead and put that in the camera so you can see it side by side. The coil is so perfectly matched to the wick that you might have some difficulty feeding that coil into the wick. If we try to just push it directly through like we did with the larger size coil, you'll find that it catches the edge of this coil and has some difficulty going in. So, there's a couple of real quick tips and tricks of how to get this wick into this coil without damaging the wick or the coil. Probably the easiest of the methods is what we call the cut. Well, we don't call it the cut, it really is just a cut. So what we do to cut the wick to fit it into that coil much easier is we'll just take our wick like this, and we're going to cut it at a 45-degree angle. You don't want to cut much more steeper than that. Like, you don't want to cut a really steep angle, because what that does is it will destroy the weave and it makes that wick sort of fall apart at the end. If we cut it too shallow, then we're not cutting it we're not creating a tip or an angle to aim that wick into the coil. So we found that a 45-degree cut works best. And you notice when I cut that material, it gives us a nice sharp point of the wick. I call it the hypodermic wick because it's kind of like a hypodermic needle. What I usually do when I'm going to feed this wick into the coil is I'll just take my fingers and just wet them a little bit, and then I'll use that to wet the end of the wick. And what that does is it just helps lock those fibers, in place so that while we're putting it through the coil, they kind of stay together. So we'll go ahead and take our 1/16 inch size coil and we'll start feeding the wick in. Now the key here is don't force it. We don't need to force the wick into the coil. What we want to do is just go ahead and start it into the coil, and then once we have the tip of that wick in the coil, try to make sure that all edges of the wick are sort of inside the diameter of the coil itself. And then rather than forcing it, what you want to do is take the wick and gently twist it along with the grain of the coil as if we're screwing it into the coil. Just real gently twist the wick while you kind of sort of push it through gently. But again, we're not putting a lot of pressure to put it through. We're just putting a little bit of forward pressure as we twist gently. And you'll see that goes into the coil very, very easy this way. Again, the main factor, the main key there is to make sure that you're rotating the wick in the direction that the coil goes, so that you're screwing the wick in as opposed to unscrewing it out. Once we have that coil on that, or once we have that the wick inside the coil, you'll find that it moves from left to right quite easily. When you do move the wick around the coil, you can kind of feel as you move it, move the coil through the wick, you can kind of feel a little bit of a resistance, basically to where you can just feel the wick, touching the coil. It's not a lot of resistance where you're having to pull it through or tug it to get it through. You can tell that the wick isn't being crushed at all. It's not being, squished. It just moves quite freely through that coil. That would be exactly what you would want to use typically for READYxWICK Slim, the 2mm product. The advantage here is that you have great coil contact. Your heat transfer is going to be fantastic, and it's just going to work really good, especially for like your 50-50 blends or maybe your higher PG blends, where that liquid really goes through that wick quite well. Again, for the higher VG blends, you might want to use the other coil, which is the 5/64. Let's go ahead and talk about the bigger brother to READYxWICK Slim, which is the regular READYxWICK. This is the 3mm product. To give you a size comparison between the two, this is READYxWICK Slim. This one here is READYxWICK 3mm. So it's a decent size, it's a decently larger. So what kind of coils do we want to use for READYxWICK 3mm? What we have here in our tray of coils is a 3/32, a 3/32, a 7/64, and a 1/8. Let's go ahead and cover all three and tell you why you wouldn't want to use two of those coils and why one of them is perfect. We'll start with the 1/8. You can see, if we look at the size comparison for 1/8 to the wick itself, the 1/8 coil is quite a bit bigger than the READYxWICK 3mm product. Here again, you can actually even see, if I angle it just right, you can see through that coil the air gaps between it and the wick. Okay. So for that reason, a 1/8 inch size coil would be a little bit too big for READYxWICK 3mm. This might work if you use, again, high VG blends that have a little bit thicker oil, that have a little bit thicker juice. That might work well for you. But stereotypically, a 1/8 inch pre-coil is going to be a little too large for READYxWICK 3mm. On the same token, a 3/32, which is another size people often try to use with 3mm READYxWICK, is just too small. You can see here from the size comparison, there's no way that we're going to fit that wick into that coil without damaging the wick. Oftentimes people try to shove 3mm READYxWICK into 3/32 inch coils. And what happens when they do that is that the coil, or rather the wick, gets choked off, and it just isn't able to channel the juice into the coil as well as we would want it to. So again, 3/32 you would not want to use for READYxWICK 3mm. The perfect size coil to use for READYxWICK 3mm we have found is the 7/64 size. You can wrap this coil around a 7/64 inch drill bit, and you'll find, as you can see from the side-by-side size comparison, the wick is just slightly smaller than that coil. Again here, just like we had on the 2mm version, the coil is, or rather putting the wick into that coil might be difficult because of its size. So what we can do is go back to our 45-degree cut method. Go ahead and cut off just a little piece, just the end of the READYxWICK 3mm. When we cut that, we just kind of wet the end a little bit and kind of aim it, kind of help it go into a little bit of a point. Take our coil, feed the wick into the coil. Oops, I always do this. It's always easier for me with the right hand since I'm right-handed. So again, we're going to take that wick, feed it into the coil, and just gently rotate as we sort of put forward pressure on it to get it to go through. And before you know it, that wick is on that coil quite well. And again, when you pull this wick forward or push it reverse, you can see there is a little bit of resistance to it, but not much. That wick flows quite freely along that coil. At the same time, though, if you were to try to shake the coil off the wick, you're not going to be able to, because it's just snug enough where it's holding itself in place on the coil, but not too snug where it's reducing the chambers that the juice would flow in. The number one thing with READYxWICK that you don't want to do is crush it. You don't want to put too tight of a coil on the product, because what that does is it crushes the juice chambers, and then the e-juice has a difficult time transferring through the wick. So you want a coil that basically fits snug, but not too tight and not necessarily too loose. So there you have it, a pre-coil 2mm READYxWICK using a 1/16 size coil, or if you're a high VG user, you might have better luck with a 5/64 inch size coil. And then you also have 3mm READYxWICK, and we used a 7/64 inch drill bit to pre-coil this one. Some of the other tips that we've also heard from users when they go to put the wicks into the coil is, you can wrap the tip of the wick with a little piece of saran wrap, and then use that to push it through the coil. We've heard some people wrap it with a little piece of tin foil. We've also had some people that wrap the end of the coil with a little bit of Kanthal. They'll kind of wrap it around the edge of it or the end of it and then just pull that through. Really, any of these methods work, but the cut way really kind of seems to be the easiest, at least for us, because you don't have to fuss with a lot of other, elements to get the coil in. Okay, so how do we wick directly on the coil itself rather than using a pre-coil for the READYxWICK 3mm product? Go ahead and get a new piece of wick here. Okay. This should work. So what we would want to do if we were to wrap directly onto the coil is we want to get something to put into the coil or into the wick itself to use as a sort of a chamber to prevent us from making the coil too tight. Because again, with READYxWICK, we want to make sure that we don't wrap a coil that's too tight. So to do that, READYxWICK is a sleeved product. Let me go ahead and cut off a fresh edge here and I'll show you. Okay. You can kind of see here that READYxWICK, see that dark piece right in the dark sort of center core? Okay, that's a hollow wick. So what we can do is we can take a metal post, you know, maybe something the size of a paper clip, like one of the larger or the thicker size paper clips, or a small metal bar, you know, or maybe even a drill bit, for example, the back side of a drill bit. And what you want to do here is just feed that bar into the inside of that coil, or of the wick rather. So you can see here we've sort of done that. We basically have taken this metal bar, try to get the angle for you, and we just kind of put it right into the middle of that wick. In fact, we could actually even just take this all the way through, and you'll see the metal bar come out the other side. Okay, so with the metal bar in the inside of the wick, we can go ahead and wrap a coil around this. Let me cut off a piece of canthal real quick. You can use really any kind of size canthal that you want. One of my favorite sizes personally is 29 gauge. I love 29 gauge canthal for some reason. But 28, 27, 26, 30, 32, really whatever size canthal that you are comfortable with, that you enjoy using to get the ohms that you want. What we're going to do here is we're just going to start the canthal by putting our thumb, leave ourselves a little bit of a leg, and then we'll put our thumb, hold that down, and then we just gently, not tight. That's the biggest keys. You don't want to wrap this stuff where you can see it like indenting the wick. You're just real gently moving the cable, or the canthal rather, around the wick. But again, not too tight because we don't want to crush the juice channels. Once you have your canthal to where you want it, or your coil to where you want it, and you can see here I did a spread coil rather than a micro coil, wrapping directly on the wick. I find that works quite well with READYxWICK. We can go ahead then and cut off the excess leg. And then remove that inner core, that inner bar. Now you see when I removed that bar, you might have seen the wick kind of move a little bit. And what that did is it made it a little bit smaller. So you see here we have again that canthal now is that same perfect size as it was when we pre-coiled this wick with the 5/64, I'm sorry, with the 7/64 inch drill bit. Moves freely, but it still has enough tension that you can't shake that coil off. But it's not too snug where it's choking off the juice channels. Okay, so there you have it. And you're going to do the same thing, with the smaller version, the READYxWICK Slim product. You're just going to need to use something smaller to put in the core of it. Maybe a needle point or something that's much, something that's pretty tiny. Maybe a small paper clip, as opposed to the large size paper clip. But you get the idea. Same general concept for either. So this is a spread coil on 3mm READYxWICK. This is a pre-made coil on a 7/64 inch drill bit with READYxWICK 3mm, and this is a pre-made coil using a 1/16 inch drill bit for READYxWICK Slim. Okay. Well, thank you for watching this video tutorial from RBA Supplies. We appreciate you spending the time to watch through the video, and if you have any questions, please feel free to leave comments on the video, or if you'd like what you saw, please feel free to leave comments as well and share if you like. We're going to go ahead and create a few video series for READYxWICK, some of the different properties of it, to help you guys out as best we can. Again, thanks for watching and have a good day.